the most unsuccessful tanks of the USSR seen in the battles of the Great Patriotic War. There's a paradox in history. When we see photographs of Red Army parades before the war, these monsters of steel and metal rumbling on their tracks over the cobblestones, it takes your breath away, especially that giant with 5 towers, towering over the crowd like a land battleship. Propaganda worked 100%. We created technology unmatched in the world. And now pay attention. Many of you have seen the Medal for Courage, the main soldier's medal. And do you know what's depicted there? The tank, the T-35, that very 5-turreted monster. This is where the interesting part begins, because the crews who were supposed to fight in this vehicle called it differently. They used the word grave, an unpleasant discrepancy, on the medal, a symbol of power, but in the trenches, an armored coffin. Today we will talk about 3 machines that were supposed to become legends but became, well, let's say, food for historians who study mistakes. This will be a long, detailed conversation with an immersion into the economy, history, and, of course, those terrible days of 1941 when everything went wrong. We'll break down the T-35, the KV-2, and the T-60. Friends, if you care about our history, if you want to understand not only the ceremonial side but also the underbelly, be sure to subscribe to the channel and write your opinion in the comments. I promise this text will make you think, and maybe even argue. But truth is born in disputes, right? Let's go. Part 1. The land dreadnought that couldn't swim. The tragedy of the T-35. Let's use our imagination. Imagine a machine almost 10 meters long, taller than a person. On it, 5 turrets like a medieval castle. 3 cannons, 6 machine guns, a crew of 11 people. 11. That's a whole infantry squad crammed into a steel box. This wonder was produced from 1932 to 39 at the Kharkov locomotive plant. A total of 61 vehicles were assembled. In the mid-30s, it looked like an alien invasion. At parades, the T-35 terrified foreign attaches. I imagine them whispering, "The Russians have a tank with 5 turrets. It's impossible." The Americans, British, Germans all had multi-turreted tanks, but to have so many guns on one platform, there was just one small problem. Real war is not a movie or a parade. When the Winter War with Finland began in 39, the T-35 wasn't sent there. Even then, apparently, doubts arose, and by June of 41, 48 of these vehicles were listed in the border districts. All of them were in the 34th Tank Division near Lviv, right where the hell began. June 21, 1941. Evening. Warm. Alarm was announced in the regiments. The mechanics drivers started the engines, and then it began. History with numbers. Why 41 tanks didn't reach the Germans. Let's look at the chronicle of the death of these battleships. There's a completely horrifying document. Acts on lost T-35 vehicles of the 34th Tank Division. When I first read it, my hair stood on end. These aren't combat losses. This is a martyrology of engineering thought. On June 22nd, the division moves out. They have 7 KVs, 38 T-35s, plus 238 T-20 SIXS and 25 BTs. Beautiful, powerful. Columns move towards the border. June 24th. 2 days have passed. 17 T-35s have already fallen behind. Fallen behind, that's a polite word. They just stopped. Some had gearbox failures, others had final drive failures. Others simply had engine stall and wouldn't start. Remember the M-17 aircraft engine? It was created for planes, and here it's a 50-ton monster. It's hard for it. It overheats, chokes, stalls. June 26th. Another 10 have fallen behind. By June 27th, all T-35s had fallen behind. Every single one. You read the Combat Action Journal and can't believe it. By June 27th, all T-35s had fallen behind. And now the scariest part. Of these 48 vehicles, only 7 were actually knocked out by the Germans in battle. 7. The remaining 41 tanks. Think about it. The tank crews abandoned their vehicles, or blew them up so they wouldn't fall to the enemy. But more often, simply abandoned them because the technology just stopped. Here's an excerpt from the Acts. Number 02004, 196 to 94, 148 to 50. Left during medium repair, blown up during retreat. Number 220 to 29, 213 to 35. Stuck in a swamp. Just stuck. In a swamp. Abandoned. Number 02008, broken crankshaft. Abandoned. Number 288 to 11. Fell off a bridge and burned with the crew. That's a separate tragedy. The bridges couldn't support the 50-ton carcass. Number 288 to 74. Failure of main and final clutches. Set on fire by the crew during retreat. Number 234 to 35. Overturned into a river upside down on its tracks. Can you picture it? The huge turret, heavy top, narrow hull, and this monster simply flips over like a drunk elephant. The Germans later took pictures with these abandoned vehicles. Wehrmacht tanks, ordinary soldiers. Everyone wanted a selfie with the miracle of Soviet technology. The Germans even sent one T-35 to the rear, to the Kummersdorf proving ground. Interestingly, when they loaded it onto a railway platform, it turned out it didn't fit within the dimensions. It was hanging over, and the mechanics moving it complained that shifting gears was hellish work, requiring inhuman effort. Why did this happen? The roots of the problem. To understand why the T-35 turned out so helpless, we need to look not only at the design but also at the economy and ideology of the 30s. Industrialization, a colossal leap. The country needs a symbol. The country needs a tank that will instill fear. The inspiration, oddly enough, came from H.G. Wells' science fiction novels. The idea was simple: more guns, better. More turrets, cooler. But there was one catch: the quality of components. In 1937, sabotage in the tank industry was a subject of investigation at the highest level. There's a secret memorandum to the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, from July 17, 1937. It says in plain text, as a result of the sabotage carried out in the tank industry, the leadership of the main directorate and tank factories is in a state of confusion. Yes, it was 37, the purges. But behind these words was reality. The engines couldn't handle the load, the gearboxes broke, the transmission was raw. The T-35 copied ideas but couldn't implement them qualitatively because the industry couldn't handle it. There were no normal materials, no normal machine tools, no normal engineers. Many were simply imprisoned. Because of the weak suspension, the tank constantly got clogged with mud and got stuck. Imagine? A combat vehicle meant to cross a battlefield gets stuck in ordinary Ukrainian mud. Now imagine the crew. 11 people. They sit in compartments, not seeing each other. The commander gives orders, but how? You can't walk through the tank. There's no normal communication. Coordinating the fire of 5 turrets in a real battle is impossible. Each turret shoots wherever it wants. It was a dead end. Beautiful, impressive, but a dead end. The Germans, by the way, had already abandoned multi-turreted tanks by 41. They understood, one person must command, one turret is main. The rest is excess weight. But we kept the T-35 in service simply because it hadn't been written off yet. You couldn't admit that the pride of the parades was scrap metal. 2 weeks. From June 22 to early July 41. The entire T-35 fleet ceased to exist. Not from the enemy, from its own weakness. But there's another side to this story that few people know. Turns out that one T-35 in late April 45 fought on the German side. Yes, you heard that right. That same tank the Germans studied in Kummersdorf was included in the 4th Company of the 11th Wehrmacht Tank Regiment. It took part in the defense of Berlin, in the area of the Zossen training ground. And it was knocked out there. Such is the irony of fate. A Soviet supertank ended its path defending Berlin from the Soviet army. If a screenwriter had made this up, he'd be called crazy. But it's true. Part 2. The Stalin's fist that struck its own. The drama of the KV-2. If the T-35 was a mistake of the 30s, the KV-2 is a child of specific military necessity. And here the story is even more tragic. It all started with the Finnish War. Winter of 39 to 40. The Mannerheim Line. Concrete pillboxes, granite barriers. Our heavy KV-1 tanks with their 76mm guns approach a pillbox, fire, and the concrete stands. The shell leaves a dent but doesn't penetrate. The pillbox continues to mow down infantry. What to do? Need something more powerful. Need a howitzer, large caliber, so that a 40-kilogram shell falls on the concrete cap and smashes it to rubble. And so in January 40, the designers of the Kirov plant are given a task: urgently, in the shortest possible time, install a 152mm howitzer on the KV chassis. The deadline, 2 weeks. Can you imagine this rush? Workers don't sleep. Engineers draw on their knees. The workshop is roaring. In 2 weeks, the vehicle is ready. They rush it to the front, near Viborg. And it works. The Finnish pillboxes, considered impregnable, shatter from direct hits of 40-kilogram slugs. The infantry rejoices. The command is pleased. The tank is adopted for service in February 40. But the triumph was premature. Gigantomania that killed the machine. Let's look at the specifications. Weight 52 tons. The turret, that's a separate story. It was huge, higher than the hull. If the KV-1 looked squat and menacing, the KV-2 towered over the battlefield like a haystack. Height over 3 meters. Special brackets were welded onto the turret so the crew could climb onto the roof. The gun was the M10T, a tank version of the 1938 model howitzer. Caliber 152 millimeters. Shell 40 kilograms. Armor piercing. Separate loading. First the shell, then the cartridge case with gunpowder. The loader had to work like an athlete because lifting 40 kilos in a cramped turret was hellish work. Now, about what parade photos hide. The turret turned manually. There were no electric drive mechanisms. A team of several people turned a crank. A full rotation took up to 10 minutes. In that time, a German tank could approach from the side, fire, reload, fire again, and drive away. Imagine you are the commander of a KV-2. You see the enemy to the left. You shout, "Turret left!" The loaders drop the shells, grab the cranks, and start turning. The tank stands still. You can't fire on the move with such a gun. The recoil is wild. It would rip the turret off. A minute passes, 2, 3. The turret slowly crawls. Meanwhile, the German has already gotten to your side. But that's not all. The economy and logistics of nightmare. Loading. The shells are heavy. The carried ammunition load was only 36 rounds. That's little. For comparison, the T-34 carried 100 shells for its gun. Here, 36. Why? Because the shells are huge, and there's almost no space in the turret. When the tank arrived at a position, the ammunition needed replenishing. This turned into a circus. The shells were fed by a crane through a special hatch in the rear of the turret. You couldn't load them manually, they were too heavy. While loading was going on, the tank stood like a monument to itself, doing nothing. Transmission. It was inherited from the KV-1, but the KV-1 weighed 47 tons, and the KV-2 weighed 52. 5 tons difference is a colossal load. The gearbox, clutches, everything worked at the limit and constantly broke down. Now imagine rough terrain. The tank drives across a field, over bumps. The huge, heavy turret wobbles on the turret ring. The metal creaks and deforms. If the vehicle tilts, the turret could simply jam. It would stop rotating. And now you're not a tank, but a stationary artillery piece. With very slow reloading. Combat use, myths, and reality. In Western historiography, for example in the National Interest, they like to write that the KV-1 and KV-2 were a catastrophe. Supposedly, the Germans simply pulled back heavy artillery and shot them from a safe distance. That's partly true. But let's dig deeper. In the Baltics, for example, the Germans knocked out 29 KVs. They didn't attack head-on, they acted cunningly. They called in anti-aircraft guns, 88mm guns that worked as anti-tank guns. Or they simply approached from the side and shot at the running gear. But the KV-2's problem wasn't so much the armor as the mobility. By 41, just over 300 had been produced. Production stopped in July 41. Why? Because it became clear the war would be maneuver warfare. The Germans weren't sitting in pillboxes. They were moving. And the KV-2 was not suited for maneuver warfare. However, in skilled hands, there are legends about one KV-2 that, in the first days of the war, held back an entire German division's advance for several hours. It sat on the road, knocked out several tanks, destroyed a column of trucks. The Germans couldn't knock it out. Their guns couldn't penetrate the armor, until they brought up an anti-aircraft gun. Whether this is true or not, historians debate. But in principle, it could have happened. Because against infantry and light vehicles, the KV-2 was a monster. But such episodes were rare. Mostly, the tankers suffered. Engines overheated, clutches burned, turrets jammed. And the main thing, low speed. Maximum on the highway, 25 kilometers per hour. On dirt, 10 to 15. In that time, a German column could get far ahead. Do you know what the tankers called the KV-2? I don't know if there was an official nickname, but in memoirs, iron slips through. Heavy, unwieldy, but if it did press down, it wouldn't be easy. Part 3. A Brother's Grave for Two. The tragedy of the light tanks T-60 and T-70. Now let's come down from the heavens of gigantomania to earth. There, where not elite units fought, but ordinary infantry and tanks. And we're talking about machines that were supposed to be the eyes and ears of the army, scouts. And they became brothers' graves. The T-60, a small tank. Weight, 5.8 tons. Crew, 2 men. Armament, a 20mm automatic SHVAKT cannon, a tank version of an aircraft cannon, and a machine gun. It was produced at ordinary automobile plants, including GAZ. The technology was simple, the steel needed was the most ordinary. Over the war years, more than 6,000 were made. And it was a salvation in 41. When factories were evacuated, when there was a catastrophic shortage of everything, the T-60 could be stamped out of almost anything. But for the crews, it was a one-way ticket. Why BM-2? In the Volgograd region, in the Surovikinsky district, in 2011, a T-60 tank was raised from the bottom of the Dobraya River. It had been lying there since 42. And when they recovered it, local search teams confirmed a terrible thing. The soldiers called this vehicle BM-2, which stood for Brother's Grave for Two. Armor thickness, front, 25 millimeters. Side, only 15 millimeters. A German anti-tank rifle could penetrate that side from 300 meters. A heavy machine gun could penetrate from 500. Imagine you're sitting in a tank. Infantry is advancing on you. The infantrymen have anti-tank rifles. They lie down, aim, and shoot through your side. You can't do anything, the armor only holds rifle-caliber bullets. The T-60's gun could fight light armored personnel carriers, trucks, infantry. But against German tanks, it was useless. T-1, T-2, T-3, even their frontal armor couldn't be penetrated by a 20mm shell. At most, hit a track, a vision device. In short, scratch it. The Germans, by the way, called the T-60 locusts, not because they were afraid, but because there were many of them. They appeared everywhere. They were fast, but they didn't sting hard. The human factor, 2 in a boat, not counting the enemy. Now imagine the crew. 2 people. The commander, who is also the gunner, and the mechanic driver. The commander must observe, detect targets, aim the gun, fire the machine gun, make decisions. The mechanic driver must drive the tank. In battle, the commander is glued to the sight. He searches for a target, fires. At that moment, he sees nothing around him. Meanwhile, Germans could be approaching from the flanks, an enemy tank could appear, an anti-tank rifle could be aiming. The commander doesn't see. He's busy shooting. Do you understand the tragedy of the situation? You either shoot or you command. It's impossible to combine both in one person. As a result, the tank lost control and became easy prey. When the T-70 appeared, it was armed with a more serious 45mm gun. That was more substantial. But the problem remained. One person still sat in the turret. He was the commander, gunner, and loader. Imagine this multitasking. You need to turn the turret manually, aim, load, fire, and also watch the battlefield. Give orders to the driver. This was terribly inconvenient. The Germans in their tanks had a commander who only commanded and a gunner who shot. We saved on people because we thought the tank should be small and cheap. But was the T-60 completely useless? Not quite. It had one advantage. It could go where a large tank would get stuck. It was light, nimble. It could transport infantry across the battlefield at speeds up to 50 kilometers per hour. In 42, near Stalingrad, this was used. The T-60 could go through a swamp, through a forest, dart through where German tigers got stuck. But it was a war of mosquitoes against lions. When the lion turned around, the mosquito had to fly away. If it didn't make it, it was simply crushed. Part 4. Economics and Choice. Why they fought with what they had. Now let's step away from the steel and look at human logic. Why did Stalin, the marshals, the people's commissars, why did they send obviously weak tanks to the front? Surely no one understood that the T-35 was a coffin on wheels, that the KV-2 was too slow, that the T-60 was a trap? They understood, of course. But there's one rule that applies in any war. A bad tank is better than no tank at all. And here we come to the main point, the economics of war. The catastrophe of 41. By June 41, we had, by various estimates, about 23,000 tanks. A huge armada. But the quality, most were obsolete T-20 SIXS, BTs which burned like matches. In the first weeks of the war, losses were monstrous. By the autumn of 41, we had lost up to 90% of our tank fleet. 90%. That meant the army was left without armor. The Germans are advancing on Moscow, and we have no tanks. What to do? Evacuate factories to the Urals, to Siberia. Set up production from scratch. In conditions where machine tools are placed in the open air, where workers sleep in the workshops for 3 hours. At this moment, two things matter: simplicity and mass production. The tank must be such that it can be made at any factory, from any metal, with minimal requirements for worker qualification. Here, the T-60 was ideal. It was made at automobile plants that had been stamping out MKs and Politorkas before the war. No complex armored alloys, no tricky transmissions. Simple, cheap, robust. The Germans, by the way, were shocked by our approach. Each of their tanks was a work of engineering art. Expensive, complex, slow to produce. Ours was stamping. And when a German Tiger broke down, it was sent back to Germany to the factory. Our T-34 was repaired in the field in an hour. Background on the tank industry. Historians, like N.N. Melnikov in his book, The Tank Industry of the USSR During the Great Patriotic War, note an interesting point. Production plans were inflated. There was a constant shortage of resources, and factories were forced to fend for themselves. Simplify the design, look for substitutes, use old stocks. The refusal to reduce plans forced tank builders to modernize production, relying on their own resources. That is, if we had stopped and started making ideal tanks, we simply wouldn't have made it in time. The Germans would have been in Moscow in 41 already. But here, yes, T-60s burned. Yes, crews died. But at least they could fight, they could delay the enemy, they could buy time to bring up reserves. Lend-Lease and our factories. Speaking of resources, in the Russian State Archive of Economics, there is a whole collection of documents on the war economy. There you can see how the evacuation worked, how production was established, how Lend-Lease helped. Deliveries from the USA and England gave us aluminum, explosives, tanks. But we made more of our own tanks. The T-34, yes, it became a legend. But the T-60 and T-70, these were the ones that held the front during the most difficult period. 41 to 42. When every tank counted, when even vehicles that should have long been written off were in service. Part 5. The Paradox of Memory. The tank on the metal and the tank in the trench. We started with the metal for courage. It depicts the T-35. Proud, powerful, 5-turreted. Why precisely it? After all, it was a failure. Here we step onto the shaky ground of symbols. The metal was established in 38. Then the T-35 was the pinnacle. It personified the power of the Red Army, the power of industrialization. No one thought that in 3 years it would become a heap of scrap metal. They didn't change the image on the metal. Firstly, it's technologically difficult. Secondly, why? It's a symbol. Coins often retain rulers who have already left. But the soldiers who received this medal fought on other machines. On T-34s, on KVs, on the 35s that broke down. They knew the truth. And they gave the tanks their own names: BM2, Iron, Coffins. Truth is more important than the parade. As for me, it's better to know the truth, however bitter it may be. The T-35 was a mistake. The KV-2 was an unsuccessful compromise. The T-60 was a forced measure. But they are all part of our history. And it was precisely these mistakes that later allowed us to create the IS-2, the T-34-85, the heavy self-propelled guns that smashed the Reich. In 1943, when the industry got on its feet, when resources appeared, we began to make truly good tanks. But we had to survive until then. And those who fought on T-60s and KV-2s survived. Historical background: the price of metal. In total, 61 T-35s were produced, just over 300 KV-2s, more than 6,000 T-60s, millions of tons of steel, thousands of human lives. The Germans, by the way, greatly respected our ability to fight with what we had. In the memoirs of German tankers, there are moments when they describe T-60 attacks. Little Russian tanks attacked us like madmen. We knocked them out, but they kept coming. They knew their guns couldn't penetrate us, but they came to delay us. This isn't about the technology. It's about the people. Conclusion: lessons we must learn. Let's sum up. What did we learn? First, a tank is not just a weapon. It is the result of a compromise between protection, firepower, and mobility. If you overdo one, the others suffer. The T-35 overdid firepower and became immobile. The KV-2 overdid protection and became slow. The T-60 overdid mobility and became defenseless. Second, war is not a parade. What looks beautiful on cobblestones can be useless in the mud. The Germans understood this quickly. We did more slowly, at the cost of blood. Third, industry decides the outcome of war no less than generals. The ability to stamp out tanks by the thousands, even if bad ones, but by the thousands, this saved us in 1941. The Germans made quality, but few. We made many, and that many was enough to overwhelm the enemy. Fourth, the crew is more important than the steel. The best tank is useless without a crew. And the worst tank can become a legend if heroes sit in it. Feats were also performed on T-60s. Not because the tank was good, but because the people were selfless. Now, 80 years later, we can calmly analyze these mistakes. No one demands that designers be taken off their pedestals or that tanks be demoted. History knows no subjunctive mood. But knowing the truth means respecting those who fought. They didn't choose what to fight on. They were given what they were given. They did their job. And we must remember, any victory has two sides. The ceremonial side with medals and orchestras, and the seamy side with brothers' graves for two. With tanks abandoned in swamps, with 11 people in an iron box who couldn't see each other and died one by one. Friends, if you've read to the end, thank you. This was a long conversation, but history does not tolerate haste. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new materials. I'll keep digging about German tanks, about ours, and about the people who sat in them. And now a question for you. In the comments, which tank of the Great Patriotic War do you consider the most unsuccessful? Maybe you have family stories? Maybe your grandfather fought on a T-34 or a T-60. Right, it's important. We must gather the truth bit by bit while witnesses are still alive. Like this video if you love honest history. And remember, victory was forged not only in parade columns, but also in the mud, in the swamps, in burning tanks. And those who survived deserve for us to know how it really was. See you.